Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes. Can you tilt your camera up a bit and move closer to the camera? Great. Now,
in terms of the name, can I change the name? It's Kazim. I should be able to do that actually. I'll do it.
Oh, yeah, sorry, that's a mistake, of course.
That's fine, no problem. Done, sorted. Is that okay? Tilt your camera up.
Now you go dark and we'll have you back on, Raza, at approximately 20 past, if that's okay.
That's cool.
Great stuff.
Shall I mute or are you going to manage that?
If you can mute and cancel your camera, Jimmy will bring you back on at 20 past.
Just a small point. If my other computer comes on, could you go to that, please? Because it's just coming on now. So let's see.
You're going to pay for this. You're going to pay for this, Eddie, torturing us. We know where you live. We are live. Okay, friends, my name's Mick Napier, and I'm speaking to you on one of our regular broadcasts on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Today, we're going to deal with three topics which are in the news this week or have been recently or will be again. First of all, I'll be talking to Adi Mormech, who is very familiar with Palestine Action and the fantastic work they do tackling that bestial arms industry where executives kiss their children at night and then go and produce the weapons that are used to tear children apart in Gaza or Syria or Iraq or elsewhere. Adi will be talking about Palestine Action. To start, my God, the man's actually got his camera working. Although it does look a scene from a science fiction. There we go, Adi. Are you ready?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
And move, hold still, don't breathe heavily, let's not lose you again. So Adi will be talking about Palestine Action, fantastic work they do and the challenges they face, the momentous achievements they've registered and the mountains they have to climb to deal a death blow to this filthy industry that coldly and callously murders people for profit. After that, we have Raza Kazim. Raza recently saw off another attack to have him disciplined at work. Not that he's suffered earlier ones, but many of us have. Raza was the subject of a complaint by the so-called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism for something he put on his profile on social media. Raza will be talking about that. Finally, Eirik Skandra, the chair of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, but a man with more hats than a milliner's shop, very active in Friends of the Earth, an ex-Green Party candidate, the author of Environmental Nakba, which you'll have to take my word for it. It's a fantastic pamphlet dealing with Israel's ecological depredations in the West Bank. Eirik will be talking the current situation in Scotland, where the Scottish government, I hear, is leaning on the Green Party to adopt the bogus IHRA definition of anti-Semitism before they'll be allowed to become ministers in the coalition government. So there's a bill, Palestine Action, fighting off smears of anti-Semitism and a crisis or a major issue inside the Scottish government. But first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Adi Mormech. Adi, last time you were up in Edinburgh, we stood for 10 or 11 hours outside a pro-Israel event, and you've got a
shut it down
up here because, yeah. You remember we were reported as giving Nazi salutes and shouting Sikh Heils. Complete fantasy, of course, in the Jewish Chronicle.
Complete fabrication.
Adi, Palestine Action, you stand in the tradition of non-violent direct action, people who smash up Hawk aircraft cockpits, Derry, Brighton, Oh, it's a list of wonderful achievements. So, Palestine actions in that tradition, is it not?
Well, of course, and we're talking about the arms trade here. We're talking about Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest private arms manufacturer. Not only is it 85% of Israel's drones, but it's also, they own IMI, which is about small munitions, which is the guns and everything else that they're using, the rifles and the snipers are using to kill Palestinian protesters, such as the 250 that were killed during the great protests in Gaza. Elbit is all over the Israeli weapons industry. They are selling the weapons to India to attack in Kashmir, to Myanmar, to the junta there, that have been so oppressive. This is across the world. They are developing their weapons off Palestinians, off the deaths of so many.
Adi, every time you talk about that, a Tory will appear on the telly, or even Mr. Starmer's pals, and say Britain has the tightest arms export regime in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big lie. This tiny little island is the second largest exporter of weapons in the world. This, all the weapons in the world, all the horrific crimes in the world. And what you're telling me that a country that supplies £5 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen and bring about, one of the largest famine in modern history. This is horror show stuff that has been well documented, and in fact, a judge even ruled against them. But the arms trade is a toxic industry, and one in which should be hopefully one day buried in the same way slavery was buried. If that was legal at the time, we can certainly look back on that and be glad that frankly it should never be acceptable anymore. This is the same with this arms trade. It's a horror show. And of course, for me personally, I have been in Gaza for 2 years. I was in the hospitals as those kids came in one by one to the intensive care unit with dust coming off them. We were pulling young women out of the rubble of the Dalu family in 2012 with, frankly, there was 4 women killed and 4 men and 3 children, 4 or 5 children, which is 13 altogether of that one family. How many grieving tents I've been to in Gaza, how many morgues. And this is day-to-day living for a lot of Palestinians in Gaza, of which a population is mostly children. So no one's telling me that these arms companies shouldn't be held to account. And frankly, when government, since the bombing of Gaza in 2014, has increased sales by hundreds of millions of pounds to Israel and increased trade, then obviously it's up to us to take action. Now, we did, during the bombing of Gaza 2014, I was with a lot of other people from London. We took action on the rooftop of the Elbit factory in Shenstone for 3 days. And obviously, it was during the bombing of Gaza that killed, 2,200 people, including over 500 kids in 51 days. This was happening. Everyone was utterly at a loss. It's almost like you're grieving while you're taking the action, because it is hitting us right here. And for me, obviously, this is true because I was in touch with all of them. I taught a family that lost 29 members in 3 days during 2009, and they're untouching me, saying, we're all scared, Adi, can you do, what can we do? And I'm like, well, look, I can only just, send my prayers and love and everything else, and we'll just keep taking action. The world is finally, hopefully, waking up. But really, the arms industry is now incorporated 4 Israeli arms factories, 10 sites of Elbit Systems. This is one of the worst, the worst, most complicit company in Israeli crimes, as far as I'm concerned, and in fact exporting the violence, developing the weapons. So that action there, 2014, while I was on the roof, while I was a teacher in the university in Gaza, one of my students was killed with her entire family, her 2 little babies, her mother-in-law and her husband, and it was one of 90 families wiped off the citizen registry. That's a wipeout. And that was a great student of mine. Her name was Huda. She used to come into the class early, talk about her life. She was quirky, she was funny. Others knew her from the internationals that were over there, including from Manchester, where I am. So there is nothing for me, for anybody that was in those hospitals, seeing what these horrific weapons were doing. It's just, well, that was the first impression I got from Gaza, was that what on earth are we doing building these weapons when the first bomb dropped? That was my first thing that cut me, was just imagining that we are creating such it's the most lowest level of humanity to be even having an industry creating such traumatic and destructive weapons that people don't get over. The ones left behind don't get over. I knew a father taking care of his wife who never spoke again after the second son was killed. You just heard her making noises upstairs, and he had to take care of her for the rest of her life. It's that. Now, this is what the arms industry is. So what has happened recently? We did a lot of these actions 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18. We were taking roads, we were blocking. In Oldham, we were doing a lot of petitioning in town. We were there was a few rooftop demonstrations that I was on for 3 days. And we noticed all through this that Elbit was so scared they would not take us to court. They were shy of wanting the disclosure element, because we used to go to court with a huge shopping list of what we needed, what information we needed to disclose what Elbit was doing. So, of course, Elbit has kept dropping the cases. There must have been about 15 where activists in Kent for Instro factory, obviously the Oldham one here, which is the Ferranti, Elbit Ferranti, and then you've also got Shenstone, which is the UAV engines, which is drone engines. That's the roof I was on when my student was killed by a drone. This is an Israeli arms company. There's lots
of these companies up in Scotland as well. But can you just chat for a moment or two? Apparently, when arms executives went in court in Derry and in Brighton after they smashed up the factories there, they got a mauling in the dock. I mean, they were really, really roasted for their lies and their prevarication. Are you saying that they're afraid to come into court and face you?
They certainly have been. There's no question. They have been. And they've even dropped some of the charges recently where the new group, Palestine Action, have really cranked it up. And they have said, we are going to make your life impossible. You're not going to be selling these weapons anymore. And in the great tradition of direct action, and coming from Manchester with the history of the suffragettes who were smashing windows all over the place, and a hell of a lot more, and lots of other people that have driven the boundaries, pushed the boundaries, that have said we are going to take action. And if we're going to sing We Are All Palestinian, and Palestinians are marching towards the bullets when they protest, and the amount of violence that took place against them, and when you imagine the level of courage that it took in Egypt for the revolutions there, people were being grabbed and taken to the city, and had we not all grabbed each other, there wouldn't have been the revolution. It was dangerous, and then many people got killed in Egypt. Tunisia, 23 years of dictatorship was turned on its head by just people power taking action, dropping everything, saying enough is enough. And if there's ever a moment for that, which I think Palestine Action understands for both the arms trade, which has had, frankly, nowhere near enough of a light put on it. This country here in the UK, this liberal facade, yet look at the amount of weaponry we're producing. And when you've experienced the weapons like I have, I was in Gaza during the bombing of 2012, and the horror show of what those weapons do when all your structures and homes that you go home to and your family go home to are just rubble, just picking through it, grabbing bits and pieces like, toys and whatever else you can find. That's it. It's gone. Everything's just gone, not to mention any loved ones that you might have had in there, or permanent injuries that you've got to take care of. In Gaza, which is an open air prison, when you look up, it's F-16s in the sky, drones, and the gunships on the sea and everything else. So this is for real, a siege and a horrific treatment of an entire population.
Palestinians are under the fiendish bombs. They are resisting to the limit of their ability. They can give no more, but the trail of manufacturing leads back to us. It leads back to where we are strong, and designs, the pro-Israel brigade, are deeply unpopular.
Yeah, for sure.
So the Connect is huge. We have to take action.
No, the Connect is huge. It's massive. It's right on our doorstep. People in Oldham are sick. I've just been in Oldham today, actually, speaking to a lot of residents who, are absolutely, who can't believe that this factory that looks like a big sort of mill, a biscuit factory, is sitting there right on their backyard. Now, what I would say is, when we were doing the actions, and we did a lot of rooftop actions, and then they kept, letting us off because they felt they could incorporate these protests. They felt that they're making enough money, they can keep building as long as it's just a few days here and there, and what would the bosses have been saying? Well, the bosses would have been saying, well, they're not causing any damage at least. So you think of it from their point of view. They're making these horrific weapons that are developed by more bombing, and they've actually come out and said that, how they test their weapons on the human population of Gaza, this human laboratory, and then they get the feedback, and then they figure it out, and then they build again. And this is why a lot of high-tech machinery and drones are the highest technology is coming from Israel, because they've got a whole captive population to test it on, unlike a lot of other countries. This is the sick nature of it, and their stock goes up the more Israel bombs, the more than the 66 kids that they killed in Gaza in May, 250 people, that obviously their weapons industry gets better, the profit margin goes up, the interest internationally in their weapons goes up, and it's a complete correlation with the amount of murder and trauma that they're causing. So what happened was, a group decided, right, enough is enough, and it's time to really get in the way. If we're really going to stand with them, we can stop these weapons factories. Let's stop them. Let's do everything we can to stop them. What better way to do it is this level of disruption? And it's the level of intensity is something that I've never seen in recent times in a Western country against the most horrific arms dealers in the world. And it is great, and it is real.
Eddie, we've got Brigadier General El Kabetz, an Israeli weapons salesman. He spoke at a meeting in New Mexico, and he said, "We have learned a lot from Gaza. It's a great laboratory." Yeah. So we can't allow the Palestinians simply to be used as lab rats. But if somebody can lift onto the roof of the arms company up, I'm 75, almost 75 now. There's a role for activists who have to push out the envelope, who have to make life hell for these merchants of death. What's the role for the auxiliary brigade, who can't quite get to that level?
There's a ton of roles, of course, and there's support on the ground. And I've done a lot of that with a lot of other people, and there's arrestee support. People are ultimately, the cost of taking these actions is small compared to those that Palestinians have to face and those that other people in other countries have to face. And so obviously there is care. We saw a brilliant presentation from Palestine Action the other day, and it's about having the best lawyers, frankly, for this job. It's about being sure about what you're getting into and the key rules of the game as to what you're doing. And I think they've actually done a remarkable job given the intensity of the actions. We would take, in some ways, we used to definitely look out so much to every detail, but we only did 2 actions a year. And like I said, they weren't going to budge with that. They were happy enough to incorporate. So it's only with this level of intensity that we can shut this factory down. Do we want to shut this factory down? Do we want to actually do what's enough?
Right, Eddie, you've made the case.
The Elbit presence in England. That's the big question. And that's, for me, answered clearly when we understand the true horror of what goes on. And I guarantee, I say this to the cops, even that are on the demonstrations, I say, look, I swear, if you were with me watching those kids coming into that hospital and watching the destruction and the horror in the mother's eyes, you'd be in there smashing up that factory as well, because they're the worst gun runners. And when gun runners are supplying pistols to known criminals, you arrest them, you destroy the weaponry. What about weapons of mass destruction, especially when this government is actually increasing arms sales? It's right now is the perfect time for direct action. It's the perfect time for people to say, we've had enough. We're gonna just step over that line and stop it. We're gonna stop you, and we're gonna cause as much grief as possible.
We're running out of time a little bit. Who do people get in touch with? PalestineAction.org, is that the website?
Yeah, to join Palestine Action, it's PalestineAction.org or Pal_Action, which is the Twitter handle, and on Instagram as well. And there's lots of roles. Understand what you're capable of, what you're not capable of. There's been some absolutely remarkable action, some really great narratives from a lot of new people. A lot of young people have got involved. They did an action with Extinction Rebellion, which is, we've been trying to do that for ages, crossover with the environment and Palestine, and so many ways in which people have come together to really a lot of people from all different backgrounds as well. And it's really galvanized people to know that when the political system is breaking down like it is now, and people have gone down a lot of avenues to try and stop Israel's war machine, people are just saying, right, as is a long legacy, like with apartheid South Africa, where they smashed up the cricket pitches, so many others in history where those people were the ones actually that led the game.
Eddie, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I'm really sorry, because I've carried on much longer. People who want to get in touch, PalestineAction.org. If you've got more money than you need and you want to make a contribution of energy, intelligence, or money, that's where you can go. It opens up from there. Eddie Mormech, thanks a lot. I hope we'll have you back again in the future to discuss this, that, and many other things. But thanks very much for that, for giving us that time, Eddie.
No problem. Thank you very much. All the best to all of you.
All right.
Hope to see you all soon.
Cheers, Eddie. Eddie Mormich knows his way around Palestine action. Okay, friends, our next guest is Raza Kazim. We apologise for the name mistake. We're knee deep in Karim's, but Kazim is a much more unusual name. Raza, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me onto the program. Very interesting.
You teach mathematics. Raza, you teach maths at Middlesex University. You were the subject of a complaint. Sorry, I muted there. Raza, I'll just ask you straight away. What was your offence? What did you do? Why do you hate Jews? What happened, Raza?
I think this is something that Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, so-called, is an organization that has actually been trying to target people who are pro-Palestinian. And they accused me of anti-Semitism. And what their issue was and what they're trying to do is conflate anti-Israeli kind of activism with anti-Semitism, and trying to conflate the two and to target people in terms of their livelihoods, their jobs, and to try and use the systems that are available to them in the workplaces and organizations and associations to actually scare people off that if you go for any kind of campaigning for Palestinian issues, we will target you by actually saying and accuse you of anti-Semitism, and then you'll have to go through the process of having to answer and explain and defend the situation and so on and so forth. And in that process, what they were doing was trying to bring up a whole host of activism that I'd carried out over the past decade in terms of conferences that I'd organized or attended or spoken at, demonstrations that I'd either organized, attended, or spoken at, media situations, TV interviews, and so on, that I had participated in and had spoken at, and basically using all of the things to try and say that this amounted to this issue, when all we were doing was actually talking about pro-Palestinian issues and highlighting the crimes against humanity that the Israeli regime, Israeli entity, was actually committing, and actually saying that this is unacceptable, that you cannot do that. Adi, you had on earlier, was talking about one particular aspect of that. And when we are saying those things, they're trying to say that somehow this equates with anti-Semitism, when in fact, in many of those conferences, many of those demonstrations, we were standing alongside people from Jewish backgrounds, whether they were academic Jews, whether they were coming from a religious Orthodox background, whether they were non-religious, and people from a Christian background, people of faith and no faith, actually standing together and saying that these crimes against humanity are unacceptable. So all of those kind of different scenarios were presented as somehow being situations where anti-Semitic sentiments had been expressed, when what we were all talking about were highlighting that this kind of thing and dehumanizing of Palestinians cannot happen. We're going to carry on speaking up for Palestinians regardless of what they try and do in terms of trying to target or trying to paint us in a particular corner. And it's not going to work, because it is something that is going to be continue to be challenged.
So you said in your personal profile, not in a lecture at university, but on your Facebook, you said the world has got rid of Nazism, the world has got rid of apartheid, now we have to get rid of Zionism. Was that the substance of the complaint against you, Raza?
That was certainly an element of what was actually being said. And I think one of the things that they, again, trying to do is that somehow this was trying to mix different things up and trying to say, conflate again, that somehow issues to do with any kind of anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli kind of activity was the same as conflating it with Nazism and so on and so forth. And that kind of issue was brought out to the front, when in fact it was clearly stated that these are different, these are things that are issues. The world has stopped Nazism. The world has stopped apartheid, and the issues that are going on with Israel and so on need to be challenged, need to be stopped, because this dehumanizing of Palestinians cannot continue. And what you can't do is say that when you say anti-Israeli sentiments, as you would say anti any government things in the world, be it our own or any other, it would be perfectly legitimate for us to be able to express those sentiments, yet somehow it is being suggested that saying it in this particular case is going to amount to a form of racism is unacceptable. It is not acceptable for somehow that the Israeli regime, the Israeli entity, can get away with that and try to hide behind that, because it is not acceptable. I mean, B'Tselem, the human rights organization in Israel, Human Rights Watch, have both commented about the issue of apartheid and the way that the Palestinians are actually being treated. And it's not going to stop us as Palestinian activists from speaking up about that.
But actually, Raza, although Human Rights Watch said Israel is an apartheid state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, B'Tselem went even further. They said it is a Jewish supremacist state based on that ideology dominating every facet of life. So presumably they would have been complained about by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Let's come into one thing about this IHRA. Don't comparisons with the Nazis. Gerald Kaufman did it in the House of Commons. He said his grandmother was killed by a Nazi stormtrooper, and he drew comparisons between that. He said, my grandmother didn't die so that Israel can kill Palestinian grandmothers in Gaza. So the parallels there. Hayo Meir, an Auschwitz survivor and friend, an Israeli general, a senior general a few years ago, said things in Israel now remind 1930s Germany. That parallel is made very, very frequently by all sorts of folk. Did this come up in any disciplinary charges, Raza, any disciplinary process?
I think the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA, as you referred to it, it's certainly been adopted by Middlesex University. And that is something that was referred to. But the issue was that the people that you've mentioned, the people that you've referred to in terms of who have drawn those comparisons, and that discussion is certainly one that those people have had, was not even a discussion that I'd entered into. This was, as you said, something that was on a WhatsApp profile and not out there in the public domain, and certainly not something that had been discussed within the university. But it's in terms of the definition and how it is being weaponized, I think that's something that is needs to be thought about by all the organizations that are being pressurized into adopting this particular definition, and those that have adopted this particular definition need to think again whether it's appropriate to do so, precisely because of the contradictions and complications that it actually throws up. Human rights organizations have come up from within I think Jerusalem, that there is a definition of anti-Semitism, and this particular definition that is used by the IHRA is being criticized and not considered fit for purpose in terms of dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism, which again is something that obviously needs to be dealt with, as does all forms of racism that are there. And we need to recognize that this weaponization of this to actually try, and the issue here is not whether we are prepared to fight this racism of anti-Semitism, because obviously all of us who are going to be in this program today will have no issue with fighting that. The issue is whether this is going to be weaponized to try and silence us from actually speaking up for Palestinians, and to actually say that this kind of racism is not acceptable, that is being committed against the Palestinians.
Hasn't the author, the drafter of the IHRA definition, gone on record to say that it is being used to shut down debate and discussion, and he's condemned that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And this is something that in itself is very problematic. There are all sorts of criticisms that are actually being made of this definition and the way it is actually being used, because the definition itself, and the subtext and the kind of further explanation that is provided underneath the definition is also very problematic in terms of how it is being recommended that it is used. So while the definition itself may not have any reference to the issue of anti-Israeli sentiment and so on and so forth, the explanation and examples that are provided that accompany this definition do give that, and that gives a steer to people who are not necessarily well versed in the issue of Palestine and the dehumanization process that the Palestinians have faced over decades, and to say that, look, this is not going to work because it is stopping people from actually being able to express it, because they know that if they do express pro-Palestinian sentiment, then this is going to be weaponized and used to actually target them. And, you know, we've had the case of Nazim Ali, which has been in the media as well, where the General Pharmaceutical Council has been encouraged to strike him off the register because of not something that he did which was against the law in any way, shape or form. He's been through a different, whether it's the Crown Prosecution Service or various other bodies, going through actually recognizing that there was nothing wrong that was said at a demonstration, and there was no reason for anyone to consider there to be an issue with regards to what it was said. But also there's a wider issue that comes out of this, that it's what you are, if this is allowed to go ahead and the General Pharmaceutical Council, it does strike this person off the register. And I know that the Islamic Human Rights Commission, for example, is resisting that. And, if people want to follow that case, they can certainly do that on there. Then it's going to impact on a number of other people around the country in terms of the precedents that it will set about what you can say outside and what you can actually do before you're going to be targeted in this particular way. And I think that's something that people really need to take on board.
If you've been through this, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. We know that from immunology, but how do you feel afterwards? Are you ready for another fight?
I think now that we are in this kind of arena, at one level, it is a relief that you've that your job hasn't gone, as it were, and it has not been. The university has been able to see that what we were doing was there was nothing wrong with it whatsoever. But at the same time, it strengthens your resolve, because in Palestine, they're not losing their jobs. They are literally losing their right to schooling. They're losing their right to jobs. They are literally losing their right to life. They're being bombed. Their houses and spaces are being decimated. And on a regular level, they're being forced to go through checkpoints and so on and so forth. So in terms of that kind of resolve to actually recognize that this is something that is going on with them, and that you need to make sure that their right to dignity and their right to respect and is more important in a way than what we could go through here. And it is certainly something that we're going to continue to do, that we're not doing anything illegal. We're against racism, all forms of racism, and that fight against racism is going to continue. And anything that is going to happen in terms of making sure that we speak up for the rights, or that I speak up, and any organization that I'm going to be working for in terms of human rights and so on and so forth, will continue to speak up for the rights of Palestinians. That is not going to stop anytime soon. I'm definitely resolved to make sure that that continues, and continue the fight in whatever is required.
Well, Raza Kazim, I guess your family came from the Indian subcontinent at some stage and washed up on these shores. God knows why you came. But anyway, they did. Isn't every anti-colonial movement demonized? Is there an attempt to shut down any group that points out the barbarity of colonialism, whether it's in India or Kenya or Israeli colonization of Palestine? Does this not go with the territory, Raza?
Yes, I think it does, and I think that anti-colonial struggle, I think, is something that is continuing even today. I think that idea of making sure that you decolonize not only the physical colonization of actually throwing out the colonizer in whatever way and whatever process is actually used to throw them out, but also I think the colonization hasn't finished. It is still there. The structures of colonization are certainly there in the subcontinent, and they're there in different parts of the world. The colonization has taken place, has taken different routes from different parts of the world. So you had the indentured labor. That was the feature of subcontinent. You have the slave trade in Africa, and I think it's and the industrial level of and the industrial scale in which the European powers actually carried out that colonization of the majority of the world, or whether it's forcing the Chinese population to take the opium drugs and forcibly sell it to them, which the British have done. There is a whole list of issues that exist, and I think when I talk about these things, there are two people that I quote. First one is Winston Churchill, ex-prime minister, and he said the empires of the mind are the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. And I also quote a South African activist who was killed by the apartheid regime, and actually say that it is the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I think if you combine those two ideas together, what you're seeing is the fact that we need to recognize that these are the kind of things that really need to be challenged in terms of how we are thinking about colonization, that this colonization is continuing. The structures that have been built up in the world are still there, and it needs to be continually resisted and fought. And when we are doing some of the activism and so on, we need to keep that bigger picture in mind as we go through trying to challenge those structures.
Raza Kazim, thank you very much for joining us today. You can contact
Pleasure.
Raza. He works with the Islamic Human Commission. We'll put the website up in the chat box in a moment. But if you want to contact Raza to carry on any of these conversations, you can do so. Raza Kazim, thanks again for joining us today. Inspiring. He was in the crosshairs of the campaign against anti-Semitism and saw them off. Great. Final guest today is Eirik Skandra, chair of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He wrote a very, very fine letter recently to Nicola Sturgeon, entering into the discussion around the Scottish government asking the Green Party to adopt the bogus IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. He's going to be interviewed and join a conversation with Amina Abdel Khalik. Over to you guys.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, I'll just mention some of your extensive credentials, Eirik, although I think it would take probably 20 minutes to actually get through them all. But briefly, you're a senior lecturer at a university. You've got quite an extensive background in environmental research and activism, former head of community action at Friends of the Earth. And I know you're chair of Scottish PSC, of course, and very active in Stop the GNF. Eirik, thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Mick had mentioned about this letter that you had recently penned to First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. Really incorporated quite a lot of things within that letter, but it reminded her and the Scottish Government of the fallacies of the IHRA, some of which we've mentioned today already in the previous interview, and urges the Scottish Government as well to take on the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. Can you let us know what prompted this letter and some of the context around this?
Certainly. Well, for those outside of Scotland, you may not realise, but there has recently been publicity where the Scottish Government has been formed as a not quite a full coalition, but a confidence and supply agreement between the Scottish National Party, which has just short of a majority in the Parliament and has formed the government, and the Scottish Green Party, which has 6 members of the Scottish Parliament, one of whom is essentially the Speaker. So 5 active MSPs, and they had negotiated this agreement, this confidence and supply agreement, in order to provide support to the government, to form a majority government, and to ensure that the government was confident that it would be able to deliver its program for government. Now, when that happened, the former leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, quite a prominent Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament, Jackson Carlow, decided to make some mischief and wrote to the First Minister to say, well, look, the Scottish Green Party has not signed up to the IHRA. It's the only party elected to the Scottish Parliament which hasn't signed up to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so Mr. Carlow said, therefore, it would be inappropriate for Greens to serve as ministers in the government. It just so happens that I have to emphasize, I'm not here speaking on behalf of the Scottish Green Party. But 6 years ago, I was part of a small group which helped to put together the Scottish Green Party's policy on Israel and Palestine. And I moved it at a conference, and it was adopted. And it was that policy that Jackson Carlow was using to try and make some mischief, I suppose, for the new coalition government. Now, I wrote the letter particularly because I thought this is an excellent opportunity to expose just how dangerous the IHRA definition is. So the Scottish Government has signed up to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and Mr. Carlow, in his letter to the First Minister, drew specific attention to one of the parts that Raza mentioned earlier, which the examples that are part of the so-called definition, that denying the rights of Jews to self-determination, including claiming the existence of a state of Israel, is a racist endeavor, could constitute anti-Semitism. So Mr. Carlow had put his finger on exactly why the IHRA definition is not a definition of anti-Semitism, but is a deliberate attempt to try and mute the criticisms, the critiques of Israel as a racist endeavor, as a colonial state. I thought that was quite helpful. So we thought, let's take advantage of that and try and expose it. I'm pleased to see that the Scottish Green Party has made a statement defending its policy on Israel and Palestine. The policy is actually based on, Jackson Carlock called it an extremist policy. It's actually based on what is we all would probably take as taken for granted, and a lot of academics would take for granted, is that actually it's a settler colonial state. It's a colonial enterprise. In fact, the Zionists early in the 20th century were very explicit that it was a colonial project. That's what Zionism was. It's a colonial project. The Jewish Colonial Trust was the bank that was set up by the World Zionist Organization to fund it. So it wasn't as if it was anything controversial to say that Israel and the kind of occupation and colonization of Palestine is actually a colonial project. So the policy of the Scottish Green Party is based on that. However, Mr. Carlaw calls that extremist, and we thought, well, here's a good opportunity to say to the government, actually, maybe it should be going the other way around, that the government should abandon its commitment to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Certainly not abandon its commitment to anti-Semitism. We're all in support of that. There are other definitions available, as you say, and we're not necessarily saying that the government should endorse the Jerusalem Declaration, but it's there, and it's certainly an alternative. If they want to have a specific commitment to a particular definition of anti-Semitism, then there's one that isn't designed to be weaponized to silence those who stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the JDA's definition, and it is, in my own opinion, much, much more profound and does a whole load better to tackle anti-Semitism than the IHRA. Do you think, although you don't have a crystal ball and you may not know that you won't know the answer to this, but do you think that the Scottish Government will pressure the Greens successfully, or do you think Nicola Sturgeon could just draw a line under this and move on with more pressing things?
It's a good question, and I don't have the crystal ball. So the fact that the Green Party has come out defending its policy on Israel and Palestine is a positive thing. My gut reaction is to say, never trust a politician. There are possibly a few exceptions, but I think it would be difficult, partly because of the Scottish Green Party's policy, and in fairness, the spokesperson on external affairs, Ross Greer, in the Scottish Parliament for the Greens, has quite regularly raised questions and been challenged the Parliament on Israel and Palestine, and has stood up for the Palestinian human rights in the Parliament. So with that history, it would be quite difficult, I think, for them to buckle. But politicians do buckle, and depending on what the reward might be is there. I mean, in terms of the confidence and supply agreement, external affairs is explicitly excluded from that agreement. So the Scottish government has very limited powers on external affairs anyway. Because IHRA is supposed to be a definition of anti-Semitism and not an issue about external affairs, Mr. Carlaw has explicitly pointed out the fact that it is actually about external affairs. It's actually about a pro-Israel and a silencing of Palestinian human rights definition, and not actually anything to do with anti-Semitism. So who knows what will happen, particularly for the two Green MSPs who have become ministers. I certainly hope that they have the moral fibre to be able to stand against any kind of pressure. As you say, it's probably not the top item on the First Minister's agenda, and it may well just go away. But essentially, it's the Tories that have been trying to make mischief with it, so they may continue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's quite staggering, really, that most of the governments, devolved governments, parliaments in the UK seem to have just taken on this IHRA with literally very little hesitation. So we do commend the Green Party for their stance. But the other domain that IHRA really affects isn't just government, but academic institutions as well, Eirik, and you are part of an academic institution. How do you feel that definition has really impacted on sort of the academics in the university field?
Yes, I mean, of course, in England, Gavin Williamson has put pressure on the universities to adopt IHRA, and there have been a number of institutions that have done, as well as some valiant rejections of it as well, UCL being a recent example. But in Scotland, there is no official pressure to adopt the IHRA. Nonetheless, there have been a number of universities who have. So the pressure must be coming from elsewhere. No doubt the Zionist lobby themselves. And it's still bubbling away. We keep hearing of other discussions going on in universities. The very fact that it's being debated is something that for people like myself, and I suppose Raza and others who are confident of their positions, who are long-standing solidarity activists, it's not really much of a problem. Obviously, they can use it to try and discipline us, but I think the biggest problem is on those who are perhaps a little bit less confident. They basically can see the abuse of human rights of the Palestinians. They want to support it, but they're perhaps less confident, and so they just keep quiet because they know that the IHRA is around. The trade union that I'm an active member of, the University and College Union, at its last Scottish Congress, adopted a position against the IHRA, and since the regional official has written to the principals of all the universities in Scotland, urging them to reject the IHRA and giving all the reasons why, and Raza outlined a number of them. Some of those principals, I believe, have replied, others have not. It's still an unclear area about how many of the universities are thinking about it. Certainly the university that I am in hasn't, and if I get any wind of an attempt to do so, I mean, I have already written to my principal, making very clear that well, asking him whether he's been put under any pressure, and to make it very clear how dangerous it would be to adopt that. At the moment, as things stand, I haven't had a reply from him, but I think it is important for those of us in the university sector to keep that pressure up, because certainly the Zionists are keeping the pressure up.
Yeah, I've just got a little question in the chat here, Eirik. Why do you think the opposition is going for shutting down debate rather than engaging?
That's a classic tactic, particularly if you don't have a good argument, just shut down the debate, and we see it in lots of areas. Certainly on this issue, the Zionists benefit from people being ignorant, people not knowing, not ignorant in a pejorative sense, but just not knowing the facts, not knowing what the situation is. And if people think actually being critical of Israel is anti-Semitic, people are afraid. People say, "Oh, they don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism." So, and also, I suppose, when people do stand up, we do get attacked publicly and sometimes threatened with violence and so on. So So it's, in a sense, it's easier. It's, again, Raza covered some of the same issues about the way that ideology is used to back up and justify colonial repression, and there's a long history of that. That Britain has been particularly good at that, at using ideology, and it's exactly the same thing. It's if you reproduce the ideology, it doesn't matter if it's inaccurate. It's simply a way of silencing debate, and therefore silencing any protest or resistance to Zionist colonization across Palestine.
Yeah, and talking about resistance, obviously a lot of that resistance is obviously Palestinians themselves, but as a wider international community. Do you think that solidarity activists, peace activists, human rights activists, have anything to be worried about with this definition, or do you think that they would be under more of an attack from the pro-Israel brigade, so to speak?
Worry about? I mean, in a sense, there is stuff to worry about, which is why we're opposing the definition. It has been weaponized. It has been weaponized, and mostly unsuccessfully, because mostly when people are put under disciplinary or investigations or whatever, it's usually found out that there is no case to answer. But nonetheless, it's intimidating. It's a way of intimidating people, and as I say, those of us who are perhaps used to sticking our heads above the parapet on this issue, perhaps expect that. But if the impact is that it keeps a lot of other people from asking questions and standing in solidarity, which I suspect that's what the main issue is. The main issue is not to get at those of us who are committed activists. It's to stop the movement from growing. I mean, it's clearly not winning, and that's why they're doing it. Movement is growing. People are realizing that Israel is a colonial state, that it's a repressive state, it's an apartheid state. Increasingly that is being recognized, and so the Zionist movement is redoubling its efforts to keep us quiet about it.
What do you think the international activists, or anyone who supports the rights of the Palestinians against this oppressive regime, what do you think they can do to pressure governments or institutions to rescind the IHRA? Is there anything that we can do on a local level or national level?
I think there's a lot that can be done. I mean, wherever people are looking at where the IHRA definition has been adopted. So in Scotland, the Scottish government, obviously, if you're a member of a political party that has adopted it, then you can keep on there. A number of, I think there are some trade unions who have adopted it, the local authorities that have adopted it. So certainly those institutions, there's things that can be done. Keep writing, keep protesting, in many ways, it should be an opportunity, because it is so obviously an attempt to silence criticism of Israel. And that's what's such a gift from Jackson Carlaw. He quoted the very part of it that demonstrates that it's actually not about anti-Semitism, but about silencing Israel and silencing the criticism of the racism that is Israel. So exposing its own contradictions is in some ways a gift, an opportunity to say to all these institutions that are adopting it, do you realize exactly what it is that you're adopting? There are other alternatives. We're all committed to fighting anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, but this is not the way to do it. This is a propaganda tool.
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes you wonder, have they actually read it and read all the examples? I mean, I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, Eirik, but when I read the IHRA definition, it was very clear. I could clearly see it for what it is. I think 7 out of the 11 examples used are mention Israel, and what Israel has to do with, Jewishness or anti-Semitism, I'm not really sure. It's a colonial state in the Middle East, not representative of Judaism and Jews. So I'm not really sure why there's been 7 examples that refer to Israel. It just seems comical if it wasn't so frightening. But as you say, it's an opportunity for it to be exposed as it is, and lots of work for activists, people, like yourself, myself, and others to just do what we can on the ground. So we've actually ran out of time so far, Eirik, but thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your really insightful contributions, and I hope you'll be able to come on again to discuss other topics.
Thank you very much, Amina. Thank you.
Thank you, Eirik. I'll pass you over to Mick now, who might want to end with a few points about next week's show and what we've got coming up. Mick, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Amina, but apparently I cannot. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I got a technical hitch. Amina, thank you. By the way, Amina's dead wrong. She says she's not the smartest tool in the toolkit. She's one of the smartest tools in our toolkit, and you'll be seeing a bit more of her as we go forward. Friends, what's in the news this week? The Israelis managed a headshot, killed a young man protesting in Beta against the seizure of village land by Zionist ultras. Gaza, probably no news this week in the mainstream media. The siege continues, the brutality, the suffering, the criminality. The 6 heroic Palestinians, 1 Fatah brigades and 5 of them Islamic Jihad, were recaptured and thrown back into Israeli dungeons. But their record, the blow they struck is indelible and will remain in people's consciousness going forward. They've shown the power of resistance, of indomitability, of not giving in, not kissing the whip, licking the boot, but resisting. And Joe Biden showed how different he is from Donald Trump by throwing another extra $1 billion at the Israelis because they asked for it. So that's the news this week. The resistance continues. BDS is not a lifestyle, it's a fight. We ask you to join that fight, become active, help to organize and plan everything from writing to councillors to adopt, to press for divestment, to tackling arms companies the way Palestine Action have done. Friends, I'll just finish a joke. An old Palestinian Jew told me a few times about 2 guys in front of a firing squad, and one said to the other, "I'm going to ask for a blindfold," to which his mate said, "Don't cause any trouble." We may not be in front of a firing squad, but the world is. The Palestinians certainly are, and we have to raise our game. Adie's points are absolutely right. The cost of rebellion, of resistance in Britain is very small compared to most parts of the world. Raza stood up to the attack and saw it off from the bogus campaign against anti-Semitism. Ari's analysis is spot on. They're trying to shut us down, not with any hope of shutting him down or myself and Raza and Adi, but to try and stop us growing out from the core into elements of the mainstream. They will not succeed. Friends, if you subscribe to Scottish PSC's daily post on this day, you will learn tomorrow about the pillage and looting by Israel using flatbed trucks to steal cars, stealing books, stealing lab equipment, pillaging Lebanon when they occupied it. You'll learn a lot more daily by subscribing to On This Day. Friends, it's a real pleasure. Mick Napier here from Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Thanks to our guests. Thanks to Amina for interviewing Eirik. Get in touch. We really value your comments. We value critical feedback. We value suggestions as to how we can do better. Please go to our website. Please like what we do on Facebook. Above all, become active. As the American poet said, there ain't nobody coming over a hill. There's no cavalry. We are the people we have been waiting for. That's you, that's me. Ain't nobody else. Ain't Keir Starmer. We're under a vicious government by a passionate Zionist and all-round slimeball, Boris Johnson. There's no mercy coming from that quarter for Palestinians or for poor people in Britain. Friends, let's fight together. We can win. but only if you become more active. Thank you very much for viewing, and I look forward to seeing you next week for 3 more informative guests and informative discussions.